draft findings in the review of the Independent Broadcasting Authority Regulations of 1999 document published by ICASA, free-to-air broadcasters are calling for the regulation of advertising in South Africa, with the SABC calling for a revenue cap on the advertising and sponsorship revenue on subscription broadcasters. To unpack this, I'm joined by Media Monitoring Africa Director William Bird. William, very good evening. Thanks for speaking to us. Just paint a brief picture for us, if you will, of the current landscape as far as advertising revenue is concerned.
So these guidelines and this report really comes on the back of a move by the regulator to have a look and see what is going on. And of course, those regulations first done in 1999, and the picture now, some 23 years odd later, is obviously quite dramatically different. And so ICASA is needing to go in and update and see to what extent these issues need to be addressed, what issues need to be reviewed, and in particular to then say, well, what does our broadcast landscape look like? And they started looking at this, if you look at it particularly in relation to television, then you start to see that the picture there is that it's dominated, or it has been dominated by multi-choice, of course, and the SABC, and then with ETV coming in a few years after that, and now you've got at least another player with Open View on the scene. So you've got a relatively small number of those players that are there, and you've then got your community television stations, which of course command a smaller, even smaller percentage of your revenue pie. Of course, the shift that we've seen, the biggest shift, has been towards online advertising, and so these regulations, they're kind of coming in and they're needing to deal with issues that were probably more pertinent 15 years ago, not 22 years ago. So to a degree, some of the issues are kind of moot, but the issues that we're looking at now are even more critical, because you're not just talking about getting a fairer share of the pie, you're now talking about getting some level of the pie that allows your broadcasters to be sustainable in a digital environment.
Now, when you look at the numbers, certainly the ones that have been submitted by eMedia, which owns free-to-air ETV and the 24-hour news channel, they've indicated in their, the way they've broken it down is that they get 21.71%, SABC 28.7%, and MultiChoice, whom everybody's complaining about, gets 39.02%. So those differences aren't huge.
Well, put like that, they don't sound that huge. But of course, when you look at some of the biggest money earners, and you look at sports and sponsorships in relation to those areas, then of course the differences then do become greater. And as we see now, as I said, with the transition of advertising, a lot of it to online formats, that pool and those percentages, and certainly those numbers, even if the percentages stay the same, the actual numbers and the amounts of money that they're making are significantly less. And of course, this is all coming on the back of the reality that we need to transition to digital, that you're talking about ETV still broadcasting in analog and SABC still broadcasting on analog, and if television gets switched off, then that'll have other catastrophic consequences for the broadcasters as well. And it's mostly about the fact that they're saying that MultiChoice and DSTV have been getting not just the lion's share, but been making a lot of money in areas where they're already making excessive amounts, and arguments that they've had just about an unfettered monopoly.
Now, I'm not too familiar with what open markets are, but I'd certainly like to think that in an open market where MultiChoice, DSTV have come into the market space and created a model, a revenue-making model at that, and they're enjoying the profits. Is it fair, is it justified for their competition to then want a piece of the pie that they've created themselves?
Well, that would suggest that they came in on a level playing field, and of course they didn't. They came in as a subscription broadcaster. For decades they had an open window system where, in addition to being subscription paid for services, that they then got more money by having their open window for a couple of hours, and then that was gradually reduced and then finally closed off, and that really allowed them to build up that kind of monopoly. You then had the delay in rollout to to digital and set-top boxes, etc. And that's enabled MultiChoice to move in and make sure that more and more people have their boxes, to the extent that they're now in over 50% of our households. So it's not as though you're talking about things that are operating on a level playing field. At the same time, you've then got the SABC, which is there as a public broadcaster, and the fact that they are having to rely for over 80% of their funding on advertising, puts them in this position where, of course, they're going to need to argue for more of that share of sustainability. So it's not as though you can just say, it's equal forces competing fairly and equivalently with each other. The playing field isn't like that. So it's not so easy to just say, oh well, let the market decide on who should get what kind of advertising.
Now, what people choose to watch is really about the value that they feel they get from any particular channel. So in the event that the authorities cut back on the revenue share, or the amount of revenue, cap the revenue that MultiChoice or DSTV is making, does it guarantee the consumer a better product?
Well, it's not necessarily going to guarantee them a better product, in the sense that they'll have better programs on the one that then gets slightly more advertising. What we're talking about now is sustainability of many of our media entities, and that, I think, is the critical issue. The SABC is there and barely able to function on an economic model that puts it at odds to a large degree with its mandate, and so you've got to find a way of sustaining that. We know that ETV.
Sorry, well, are you suggesting then that this really should be a process of allowing SABC to survive because their model doesn't actually work? Because it almost seems like you're stealing from Peter to bolster Paul, for want of a better illustration.
No, I think that the argument is that DSTV and MultiChoice have had a monopoly to a large degree, and that what you're needing to do is try and level that playing field. And many of the assertions by the free-to-air broadcasters seem to be completely fair and reasonable in that regard. What I'm saying about SABC is that its nature is a public service broadcaster, and it is having to argue for advertising revenue because it makes up 80%. What we need to do actually is find a more sustainable model for the SABC. So these regulations are, they're one very small part of something of a far bigger process, and we also then have to take into account the evolving and emerging nature of online advertising and where all of that money is actually going. So it's not as simple as saying, well, just cut the advertising to DSTV and MultiChoice and everything will be fine. It's got to be a case of, well, how do we balance those kinds of questions that are fair and reasonable about who gets what and how much and where there's a monopoly, against the issues of saying, well, how do we make sure that our media are sustainable? How do you make sure that Newzroom Afrika is able to be sustained, because it's critical that you have this kind of alternative voice in offering different news. And at the same time, you need to say, well, yes, you also need then your other alternative free-to-air channels. How do we make sure that community TV gets some kind of a shake and a share of that pie, so that they can be sustainable? So our perspective on it is one very much driven by how do we make sure that we have a sustainable media sector, because if we don't have that, then then our democracy is going to be profoundly undermined.
Well, I think you've asked those questions rhetorically, and I'm asking that very same question to you. How do we fix the situation, in your view?
So I think that part of what we need to be doing is addressing, well, there is a white policy process that is underway. We need to make sure that we get that going with far greater haste. We then need to be looking and saying, well, what are the alternative means for resolving media standards in a new advertising environment? Because even if ICASA says we're going to limit advertising and sponsorships in these areas, it's not going to solve problems in any kind of medium to long-term space. So we're needing to find very different and I think radically new approaches to how do we sustain, how do we fund particularly public service television, journalism, and then still make sure that you've got a diversity of news and entertainment and local content offerings. MultiChoice is a critical part of that, and so is DSTV in terms of those offerings. So some of those things are about balancing those forces, but it is also in this instance about addressing a debate that had we addressed it 15 years ago around dominance of market share of advertising, that maybe things wouldn't be quite as bad as they are today.
Now, this is very hypothetical, and I hope you can answer it. If SABC was running a sustainable business, and they were profitable and didn't have the numerous challenges that they have, would they still be where they're at now, lodging this complaint?
Well, if these particular issues that they're raising around sponsorship and dominance of MultiChoice had been addressed 10, 15 years ago, then their business probably would be a lot better in terms of how it's able to function. SABC, though, as a public broadcaster, we need to find a much better model for it to meet its public service mandate, because the simple reality is that public broadcasters the world over aren't there to make money, and they're not there to be profitable. They are there to offer diverse programming, views, news, content, etc., that you aren't going to get on other platforms. They're the ones that are there to say, we have to produce children's programming. We have to make sure that we can produce children's drama. Those are things that aren't economically sustainable, and why most TV stations around the world veer away from them. And that does then become an issue for advertising and sponsorship. And in fact, one of the submissions we made on this is that you can't just target any kind of advertising during children's programming, precisely because of the harms that it brings in. And that then speaks to that kind of broader ecosystem that we're needing to urgently and rapidly address. So SABC, would they still be in this position? Probably, because of the fact that it's been used as a political football. Their issues aren't necessarily purely ones around economy. But again, you shouldn't have an SABC trying to fight to be a commercial entity when in fact they're a public service broadcaster.
William, before we let you go, help me understand this. If, for argument's sake, the authorities then say that, okay, MultiChoice, DSTV, the maximum that you can make is 20 million rand per annum as a cap, what is the benefit to SABC or ETV or any other channel? Because essentially that's what they're calling for. They're calling for a cap on how much money that they can make. Now, if that cap is allowed, what is the benefit to SABC or anybody else?
Well, of course, they're arguing that because they're a subscription broadcaster, they've already got an unfair advantage because they're making their money, and to a degree, SABC and ETV are arguing that they make that money partly because of their very channels that they have on their platforms. So in saying that they should have some kind of a cap, what they're arguing for is that they should be getting a more of a share of that particular form and sponsorship, and then they would have more sustainable businesses. I mean, I guess that's the essence of it, is that when you're challenging a monopoly and you're saying they've been getting the lion's share and this is what's been happening for decades now, we need to get a bigger share of that pie. Again, as I said, this is an argument that we should have been having 15 years ago, because in the current environment, it's just it's really struggling to make sense, when in fact the biggest pressures aren't necessarily coming just from MultiChoice as it was then. They're coming from other different forms of advertising, and you have to look at how we deal with and address those, because even if we do reduce that, a lot of the advertising is going online, and that's the trend that we're seeing around the world. So it's not necessarily going to solve that problem. It still will make a big difference to the free-to-air services if those regulations are put in place that do limit that. But again, it's not going to solve their biggest sustainability crisis.
William Burr, thank you for your time. We'll obviously continue to monitor what's going on in that regard. And that was Media Monitoring Africa Director William Burr speaking to us this evening.